Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the special session of the KF Mount Halla Forum. I'm John Delury, professor at the Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies, and I'm honored to serve as the moderator for today's session. The KF Mount Halla Forum, hosted by the Korea Foundation, is an attempt to explore a future paradigm together. Mount Halla is located in the center of Jeju Island, where the KF headquarters is moved to, and is a spiritual symbol to the people of Jeju. The KF named the forum after this mountain in hopes that it can serve as a window into what Korea and Jeju have to share with the world. Under the theme of New Horizons, envisioning a better tomorrow, the aim is to share ideas and insights on what lies ahead and how to build a better future, a bit like the view from the peak of Mount Halla, especially at a time when our present world is full of uncertainty. The ambitious questions that this year's forum posits are, what is the optimal direction for our shared human future? And how can we move in that direction? Today we have invited Professor Nick Bostrom to offer his insights for us. Dr. Bostrom is the founding director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. The scope of his research is staggering. It covers philosophy, theoretical physics, computational neuroscience, logic, and artificial intelligence. He is the author of some 200 publications, including the New York Times best-selling book, Superintelligence: Paths, Dangers, Strategies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bostrom.
Hey, thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad to be with you, even though it's only in the form of a digital presence. So I thought I'd maybe say a few words about some of the things I've been thinking about recently and that we are working on here at the Future of Humanity Institute. It's been an unusual year in many ways. It feels like more than a year has passed this year, even though the year is not over. And it's been quite interesting to see how different institutions and different countries have reacted to the challenge of the pandemic. I'm sad to say that the UK, where I'm now, or my country of origin, Sweden, have not performed very well. If we just look at death statistics here in the UK, the number of deaths is 791 per million inhabitants. South Korea has done a lot better, I think 10 per million. And overall, I think it's fair to say that, at least Western Europe and America has not exactly covered themselves in glory in dealing with this. And a huge amount of attention has been naturally going to this. But while it's been interesting to follow this, it's not really the core of what I'm thinking about. If we zoom out and look at this from a kind of grander point of view, even these big events are like mere ripples on the great pond of life. So if we just look at, say, health and death as a metric, approximately 1% of the people who have died this year worldwide have died of COVID. So it really barely would even show up if you had a statistic of global death rates. That ultimately does not fundamentally change the human condition. And even at the time, it rarely registers, even though it has a huge ability to draw our attention. But what I've really been trying to do throughout my career is to think about what would it really take to, at a more fundamental level, change the rules of the human game. And so I've done work on existential risks in that vein, and a recent paper where I introduce what I call the vulnerable world hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that there is some level of technological development where civilization gets destroyed by default. So let me explain the intuition behind this. You can kind of think of human history and human creativity as the process of reaching into a big urn of invention and pulling out one idea after another, as it were, pulling out balls from this giant urn. And throughout history, we have extracted a great many balls. And for the most part, our technological discoveries have been hugely beneficial. And some of them have been mixed blessing. But for the most part, we've pulled out white balls and maybe a few gray balls as well. But what we haven't yet done is extract a black ball from this urn of invention. So this would be some discovery that invariably destroys the civilization that makes the discovery. And the paper then considers the hypothesis that there is at least one black ball in the urn. Because if there is, and if we keep progressing with science and civilization, then eventually we will reach this black ball and pull it out. So part one of the paper tries to think about what such a black ball could be. And I'll just quickly go through kind of the three main categories whereby such a black ball could exist. So the most easy to understand one is some discovery that makes it too easy to cause massive destruction. We can think back to the 1930s and 1940s, where people had just beginning to realize that you could realize the energy from the atom and unleash it. And it became clear that you could make nuclear weapons and that they would be hugely destructive. But fortunately, with respect to nuclear weapons, they turn out to be really hard to make. So you can't have some individual who just makes a nuclear weapon in their garage. It requires highly enriched uranium or plutonium, and they are really hard to make. You need large manufacturing facilities, rare raw materials, a lot of energy. It's really something that states can do, but not individuals. And so we were lucky at that time around. And now, of course, we know that it's not possible to unleash the atom of the energy through some simple thing like baking sand in a microwave oven. You really need this big thing. But before we had done the relevant nuclear physics, there would be no way to predict how it would turn out. We were just fortunate that it turned out to be hard. But if we keep making new discoveries in different technological areas, next time we might find some really easy way to cause mass destruction. Like, for example, synthetic biology might figure out ways of increasing the advanced biotechnological tools so as to make it relatively easy to create some much more virulent organism than the ones that we see arising from nature. And so next time around, rather than having something like COVID, you might have something that has a higher lethality, that a longer incubation time, that has other properties that just makes it a lot more difficult to deal with. So that's type one vulnerability that could exist, one type of black ball. I'll just quickly mention the others. One would be if a technology creates incentives for powerful actors to cause mass destruction. And again, the case of nuclear weapons might serve as an illustration. There was a great risk through several decades of the last century during the height of the Cold War. We know that the world came to the brink on several occasions where it really looked quite close. But nevertheless, the situation was partially stabilized by the fact that both the Soviet Union and the United States thought they had a second strike capability. So there wasn't a rush to strike first, because even if you struck second, you still could destroy the other side. And also the best you could hope to achieve with a strike was to destroy the other side. You didn't really gain anything. You could just destroy. But you could imagine a future arms race based on some different kind of weapon system where whoever strikes first really does get a complete advantage and there's no ability for the other side to strike back. That would create a much more unstable arms race where great powers might have an incentive to use a technology destructively. So that would be a type 2 vulnerability. And a third vulnerability would be a technology that gives a lot of weaker actors incentives to each do things that cumulatively amount to great destruction, even though no one single actor causes great destruction. And here maybe we can take the example of climate change. Again, if we keep inventing new things, then maybe at some point we'll discover a technology that creates these massive incentives for a lot of people to individually do things that slightly contribute to some massive global harm. And so one can then think, and this is kind of what the second part of the paper does, what would need to change in the world in order for us as a human civilization to have the ability to keep extracting balls from the urn and yet stabilize the world in case there should turn out to be a black ball in the urn. And I argue that two fundamental things would need to change about the human condition. One, we would need to have an unprecedented ability to surveil individuals and what they are doing at all times, so that if that were the first type of black ball, this kind of easy to make nuclear weapons, you would have the ability to intervene in real time as soon as anybody started to put together the simple mechanism to cause mass destruction. So that would be one thing. And the second thing you would need is much more effective and reliable ways of resolving conflicts between great power, new global coordination, so as to reliably prevent war by great powers and new arms races. And if you had those two things in place, then we could be secure, even if we were unlucky enough that the urn contains a black ball. So that's one strand of research. And there's a lot of other work that we are doing relating to specific risk areas and thinking through the implications of particular future technologies. We've done a great amount of work on artificial intelligence, and especially the more transformative types of AI that we might invent later in this century, general human artificial intelligence and superintelligence. Also, we have a group working on biosecurity and a range of other areas. In parallel with this work on trying to understand what could go wrong and how civilization maybe needs to change on the margin to become more resilient and robust, we've also started thinking more about how things could go right. And this is one thing I'm currently working on. Maybe it will become a book. But really the problem of utopia. If you think things through further into the future and to their logical limits, this actually becomes a quite deep problem. So it's easy to look around at the world today and see this little thing be better if we fixed it, and this little other thing, it would be better if we fix it. There are a lot of little problems. Individually, it seems for every one of them, the world would be better if we solved it. But if you then imagine a world where all these problems are solved, where there are no more problems to solve, where maybe our ability as humans to contribute to the solution to any remaining problems is removed, then I think you confront some quite fundamental and deep philosophical questions. So this is maybe easiest to see in the context of artificial intelligence and automation. What would we do if robots and AIs one day become able to substitute for us across the board, if they can do everything that we can do and do it better? Of course, there's a tradition of thinking about the effects of automation and worrying about what it would do to human employment and so forth. There's a famous essay by the economist George Maynard Keynes, written in 1930, where he predicted that 100 years later, productivity would have increased by about 4 and 8-fold, and that as a consequence, the economic problem would basically be solved. He thought that that would result in a 15-hour working week by 2030. And now we can see that he was partially wrong and partially right. He was right about productivity increasing. It has increased about 7-fold since he wrote that essay. So that's well on track. We don't, of course, have a 15-hour working week, although it is true that average working hours have declined significantly since 1930s. But we have longer periods of retirement, we have longer periods of childhood and education, we have more sick leave, we have maternity leave and the weekends off. But nevertheless, it's nowhere near 15 hours. So what has happened is that we have all this extra wealth and productivity, but we have chosen to use most of it not to extend leisure, but to increase consumption. In other words, greed has triumphed over sloth. And it looks like in the near term, this plausibly will continue, that maybe people get richer and richer. They could get by working less and less and still have enough to eat and have some place to live. But our expectations for a good standard of living will keep rising. Nevertheless, at some point, if automation technology becomes better and better and eventually able to do everything that we humans can do and to do it cheaper, then at that point, there really would be no need for any more human exertion. And we would face a condition where employment is completely unnecessary. I actually think that's potentially a very good thing, provided we then figure out a way to use the time freed up in productive ways. I think that would require both some way of making sure that everybody has a livelihood, and maybe with some universal basic income or something that in those scenarios would be relatively easy to provide because the economy would have grown enormously. And then on the other hand, some cultural changes and maybe changes in our education system to actually prepare people for a life of leisure, to develop appreciation for art and hobby, the art of conversation, all of these things to take the place of the current education system, which is quite focused on trying to produce workers, people who will sit at their desk and work hard at some narrow problem for 8 hours a day. But you just have to kind of raise a different kind of human. And I think that ultimately can be done. And at that level, I think we can see the outlines of a solution to like that kind of utopia. But I actually think that the real problem of utopia goes further than that, because at technological maturity, when we really run kind of our vision of what a fully mature technological civilization would look like. It's not just that robots could do all these things in the external world that we need to do and run our farms and factories and all of that. But more fundamentally, human nature itself would become malleable with advanced enough biotechnology, neurotechnology, nanotechnology. You could actually reshape human nature in more fundamental ways. And a lot of other things that you might think would fill our leisure time. Maybe people would go, to spend time at the gym, or maybe they would spend time learning math just because it's fun, or basket weaving, or a lot of other things. Like all of those things in principle, if you had sufficiently advanced AI, right, you could imagine those doing those things for you. So instead of going to the gym, maybe you would just pop a pill that would give the same endocrine effects in the body as working out would do, and you would have so then why would you bother spending an hour in the gym if you could be equally fit by just popping a pill, right? Or you could imagine, why would you spend time studying math for fun if there were like a kind of brain interface that you could just plug in that would immediately give you the same mathematical ability? And you can kind of walk through the different activities one by one, and you'll see that at technological maturity, really most of them would become kind of pointless, because there would be this easy shortcut where you could achieve the same effect better and cheaper without having to exert any effort yourself. And the question then becomes, what remains? What would you actually do if there was nothing you had to do? If really all your efforts were unnecessary, there were easier ways to have some kind of super intelligence just achieve the same effect in the world. And I think then a very deep evaluation of activities would become necessary. The only things that would remain worth doing would be those things that we would do for their own sake, not activities that we do for the sake of achieving some other result, but activities we just find intrinsically valuable to have done in the world. And this problem goes quite deep. You might think there are certain activities that are valuable because you enjoy doing them. They bring you joy. Like playing golf, maybe you think that's a thing we would be doing because you might find it fun to play golf. But then again, at technological utopia, there would be easier ways to have fun, right? You wouldn't, if the goal was to stimulate a pleasurable state in your brain, there would be easier way through direct neural manipulation to increase your level of joy or pleasure. And you wouldn't have to travel out to the golf field and start batting with your club to do that. And so at that level, then you really start to confront some very fundamental questions in value theory. And you need to think about, if you really were freed from all instrumental constraints, what would a utopian world look like? So that's one strand of the research. There are others that have to do with how one might envisage a world where human beings share the world with digital minds, AIs that are conscious. Maybe initially we will see sort of animal-like minds based on sophisticated machine learning systems. I think we're actually approaching, say, the level of a mouse intelligence soon. And at that point, just as we think biological mice have certain moral status, like if you want to perform medical experiments on them, there's usually an ethics panel that has to sign off. You have to anesthetize them before you operate on them and so forth. Maybe similar moral considerations will start to arise with regard to certain kinds of AI systems, and then increasingly so as you get more advanced minds. And if you then start to think through this again, like when you actually have humans maybe no longer being the dominant life form or the kind of life form with the highest moral status, then what would be some kind of compact, some world where there is place for a range of different valuable forms of modes of being? And how would our ethics, how would our politics, how would our law have to change in order to kind of enable a harmonious framework where all these different life forms can flourish? So some of these are just, these are kind of big things, but that's really what our distinctive thing is here. Like we really are trying to think about these really big, deep questions. And I think sometimes if you get clearer about those, it might also have more immediate ramifications for here and now questions, because it kind of casts all our current activities in a different light than the normal one, which is very much focused on, this month's crisis or this year's political election or whatever is going on right now. I think you kind of see things in a different perspective if you come at it from this view.
Thank you, Dr. Bostrom. I wonder if we could start by asking you about this pandemic and whether it counts as what you describe as a black ball event or not. The second part of that would be whether your two proposed solutions of mass surveillance and global governance are playing out in a way you'd expect in terms of the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah. So maybe on the last part first, I would, of course, emphasize that both of these changes to global, continuous, intense surveillance, or having the capability of doing that, and very strong global coordination mechanisms, both of those introduce their own set of risks and downsides that are kind of obvious and have been discussed a lot in the literature. With surveillance, you could have totalitarian nightmares, right? That get very hard to overthrow because any rebellion is nipped in the bud. And with very strong global governance, I mean, the more you have all the eggs in one basket, if that gets corrupted or oppressive, then there might be no alternative that could take up the torch. So I completely recognize and agree about there being big downsides with both of these. And my paper kind of leaves it open, all things considered, what should we do? It just tries to sort of analyze some of the arguments on one side of the scale. But in the final reckoning, you have to consider both scales. On the COVID, I wouldn't really place it in this metaphor of the urn because it's not like a technological invention as far as we know, although it is interesting to think in terms of biotechnology, which is on the one hand what we need to solve the problem, it seems. Like obviously a vaccine would be hugely useful and diagnostics and treatments and all of that. And if 10 years from now we have better biotech, we would be better able to prevent natural diseases like this from occurring. But it is a double-edged sword. At the same kind of progress in biotechnology that would strengthen our hand against threats from nature might produce its own risks if it makes it easier to create biowarfare agents. In particular, some of the work that has been done, influenza viruses and gain-of-function research, where researchers try to anticipate future natural pandemics by, in the lab, actually creating pathogens with the same properties so that you could then study them and maybe try to develop vaccine. A great deal of concern that those might, well, A, pose an accident risk. Things can leak from these labs. And B, could facilitate developments in biological warfare or give terrorists easier access to things that are more dangerous than even some nuclear weapons. Like one nuclear weapon, the most you can do is to destroy one city. but a powerful germ, as we've seen, can really, disrupt the whole world and potentially kill many more millions. And we know, on the first score, the labs do leak viruses all the time. There's a long track record of even the most secure labs releasing pathogens. One thing one might do if one actually wants to make progress, after having recognized that there is both an upside and a downside, is to maybe start thinking then in a more sophisticated way, are there particular types of countermeasure that we should accelerate development of that seem relatively immune to proliferation risk? And others that seem more risky. So to take the obvious, if somebody invents a better face mask, for example, that's more comfortable to wear, that seems very unlikely that would produce some kind of weapon of mass destruction or some really dangerous thing, right? And it might still be really helpful. And then other things are more in between that might be really helpful to have a faster pipeline to study and analyze new organisms and understand what they do. And maybe we want to do that, even though recognizing that there are some risks. And then maybe there are other research, like gain of function research, that perhaps we shouldn't do at all, or only do in a few places around the world under the most strict security and containment measures.
So I suppose that point about what you describe as countermeasures kind of leads to my next question, which is something that I heard you discuss earlier, not necessarily in your paper, but about the golden ball. The idea that there may be something with the same, sort of equal positive power that the negative power, destructive power of the black ball presents. Could you talk a little bit more about the golden ball idea? Are there any examples from history of a golden ball, or when you're imagining the future, what do you come up with as a golden ball?
Well, I don't think we've yet had one, if the sense is that we are not now thoroughly safe and secure and safe from all risks. That would, I guess, be the kind of converse of a black ball that lays everything to waste. But we certainly could imagine, and I think artificial intelligence is at the same time could be a black ball, but it could also be a golden ball. I really think it's one of those things. And here I'm thinking not so much of the incremental advances we'll see in the next few years, but if one day we develop machine superintelligence, it seems quite plausible that if we get that transition right and get through it, then a lot of other risks that we're currently facing would kind of drop out of the picture. If you think that this kind of surveillance scenario and this global coordination scenario are alternative ways of stabilizing the human condition, then you could also imagine technologies that make those radically easier could also maybe amount to golden balls or maybe silver balls or something. And if you zoom in and look more narrowly at different risk areas, then there might be a lot more candidates for things that would create at least security within a certain sector.
Would on this topic of surveillance, you mentioned this idea of, you call it a high-tech panopticon, I think, the notion of a something wearable that would create a kind of total surveillance. And of course, that sounds pretty scary, I think, to most people when you talk about it. But maybe you could explain that idea, that thought experiment. And again, is that a golden ball, and how do you manage all of the risks that you've mentioned and all the, how would you talk people down from the fears that concept elicits?
I actually don't talk people down from the fears. And I kind of chose some of the terminology here on purpose. So the panopticon, I also, the idea would be you could imagine, just as an example, but people continuously wearing some bracelet with cameras pointing in all directions and recording devices. The data stream then being continuously uploaded to the cloud, analyzed by machine learning algorithms, suspicious activity forwarded to, I call them freedom officers, who would be reviewing this and then sending out, I call them freedom officers. Obviously, it's have these Orwellian overtones, right?
And you're trolling a little bit.
Well, I think it's to point out and emphasize the huge downsides with this. So I don't think it's something that you would want to sugarcoat so that we just swallow the idea that we should do this and then blithely go into this. I think maybe we shouldn't do this at all, or if we should, only with great trepidation and like maximum safeguard and anxiety and paranoia, because it really, these Orwellian overtones, I think, is very appropriate.
Maybe I'll move on to the next one because there's a good flow, and it also relates to your last point about maybe your next project, one of your current projects about utopia, because as I've heard your talks and read some of your work, I'm having a hard time positioning you between sort of the techno-optimist and techno-pessimist school. And again, there are elements that seem dystopian in terms of someone who imagines these existential risks. But then, as you said, you're developing ideas about utopianism. So I wonder if you could talk more about how you see that whole huge debate out there between, which sometimes seems Manichaean, the hopes and fears, and where you position your own thinking in that context.
Yeah, I often get asked this: Are you an optimist or a pessimist? I mean, I guess if I had to say something, I don't know. I'd say I'm a fretful optimist, maybe. But more seriously, I think what our role is to try to just understand with greater granularity what the levers are that exist currently for affecting the long-term future, and then trying to form some opinion about which direction actually would be more likely to improve things rather than make things worse. And so a lot of the work is in that space, and sometimes the most effective thing is to try to do something to prevent some negative thing from occurring. In other cases, it's to try to do something to ensure that something positive happens. And separating these and just looking at one it doesn't seem to correspond to a natural way when you're actually trying to do this research. The issues are very much entangled. So dealing with both upsides and downsides seem like the natural way to carve up the work.
So it's about problem solving and not choosing either optimism or pessimism, but imagining the risks and tackling them.
And then trying to understand them and more specifically how the amount of risk on different trajectories sum up and then what that relates to in terms of what we can do differently today. So for me, the really only reason to think about the longer term future is if ultimately it helps cast light on the choices we have to make today. There's ultimately for me this very instrumental and practical reason for caring about these research questions. Because otherwise, I think, to the extent that your goal is just to live a normal human life and have a family and have a job and get some income and all of that, you don't really need to think about these big picture questions. That's kind of a waste of time. But somewhere in the world, I think there should be some people who are thinking as a sort of human civilization, and as if you're an altruist who cares about even the long-term consequences of your actions. What should you actually do to the extent that that's your goal, even if it's just 10% or 1% of your overall motivation that cares about the long term. So it's actually not obvious what, to the extent that you're motivated by that, you should do. I feel like we are very much in the dark about that. We're a little bit, I think, sometimes like ants that are very busy, pulling their little straw to the anthill, but they have no conception of what they're actually building. Whether they're building, the analogy in human case, a beautiful cathedral or a just empire, or you're a soldier working hard for Nazi Germany's war machine. We don't kind of rise up to think what it all amounts to. And there just needs to be some people sometime who actually try to lift their gaze up and see what the heck is going on here. And so it's that space where we try to contribute.
The question of value, as you said, and as we can maybe come back to. I wanted to go next to ask sort of what's the connection between one of your last big projects, that you wrote the book on superintelligence, and this project of the vulnerable world hypothesis. Maybe you could explain superintelligence, what that's about. Obviously, it has a lot to do with AI, but how, what that concept is about. And again, how do you relate it to the black ball, gray ball, white ball?
Yeah, so I guess the historical context is it came out in 2014, and I took about 6 years to work. So when I started it and when it came out, this was very much a neglected area. the idea of AI as a truly transformative thing we were on the way to develop, and then there being existential risks associated with that, and hence the need to do research now on alignment methods and scalable control methods. Since the book was published, that has started to change. There is now a vigorous research field on AI safety, and a number of different we have regular joint research seminars with DeepMind. OpenAI has a big research group, and there's a whole research community now actually doing technical work on this, running code and papers with algorithms and all that. So that has advanced, and we participate in that. We also have a group working on the governance of AI to start to think about sort of the non-technical aspects of the challenge of making the AI transition beneficial, like governance institutions and all of that. And more recently, what I was alluded to briefly in my talk, the kind of third element of the AI transition, which is not just thinking about how can we make sure AIs don't harm humans. That's kind of AI safety. Also, not just how can we avoid humans using AI technologies to harm other humans. That's kind of the governance. But there is like a third element, which is how can we ensure that we humans don't harm AIs themselves once the AIs become at the level where they have moral status. So in your pocket calculator, it doesn't really matter what you do. You can smash it up with a hammer. There is no moral harm there. But at some point, if they really become like human level conscious minds, then it seems very plausible to me that they would matter morally, not just what what effect they have on the rest of the world, but how they themselves are treated. That's at a much earlier stage, but that is some kind of work we're just starting. Now, the vulnerable world hypothesis paper is not directly linked to the superintelligence thread. I guess it's, superintelligence or AI would come in there as one element, but it's kind of more trying to introduce some conceptual tools and frameworks that might help people see some of the challenges human civilization face in a different light. And if there are debates about surveillance, or if there are debates about global governance versus nationalism, like maybe these are some extra considerations that can be added to those debates and maybe make them more well-rounded. That kind of was the goal of the Vulnerable World paper.
Is there a risk of over-preparing for risk? Which is also to say, is there a need for acceptance of a certain degree of vulnerability? How do you view that question, both in, I suppose, technological, but also sort of philosophical terms?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is a cost to most mitigation things and risk aversion. And it's not at all clear that with respect to the larger spectrum of risks that we're doing too little. We might be doing too much. You'd have to, I think, look at them on a risk-by-risk basis. Certainly, I don't think we allocate mitigation effort in proportion to the magnitude of the risks. Like we are very concerned with things like airplanes crashing or terrorists blowing up, a couple of people in a marketplace or something like that. That, like, whole countries go to war, billions and billions of dollars are spent to prevent a few people from being killed in terrorist attacks. Then on the other side, there are massive risks that we seem much less worked up about. Let's say the risk of dying from heart disease, which is the most likely way that we will die, right? If you just look globally, heart disease and cancer are the big killers, and they are ultimately caused by aging. And yet, how much of an effort is there to solve aging? Very little. I mean, it's that's like maybe 70% of the deaths globally are the results of us becoming more susceptible to a wide range of. So I think there's like a radical misallocation between different risks. I'm not sure there is too little overall attention to risk. The one exception I would say, though, is with respect to existential risk, which is this very weird special bucket of risk where what's at stake is not just a lot of people dying, but humankind going extinct or the whole future being permanently destroyed. And with respect to those, I think there is too little effort.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and give you a chance, whether you like it or not, to offer your advice. We're talking to you from South Korea. This is, as you know, a pretty technologically advanced, fairly prosperous country by global standards, and also a liberal democracy very committed to being an open society. So given those conditions, there's kind of two parts to the question. One would be, how would you advise South Korea, the leadership and also the public, to prepare itself for the kinds of risks that you're drawing attention to? And then the second part would be, since this is a global civilizational problem you're talking about, what could a country like South Korea potentially contribute along the lines that you're suggesting is necessary to kind of properly prepare for risk?
I think that South Korea is in a fairly strong position with respect to, say, AI in its strong hardware base. Samsung being one of the very few players globally who is able to manufacture chips at the latest node size with Samsung, and some other players in that space might give South Korea the ability to kind of punch above its weight. So developing that and then trying to use that in a responsible way and in a helpful way, like when the time comes to actually, that would be one thing. I think in a broad general sense, I think if one looks at the root cause of a lot of problems and existential risks, I think the fact that the world is splintered at the highest level, we have different independent power centers that each make their own decisions, not in full regard of the global consequences. So you have people spending a lot of money on armaments and militaries, and sometimes war break out. And in the last century, 2 big global world wars, and who knows whether there will be a third world war. You could kind of distinguish it. That could be a world war fought with nuclear weapon. That could be a world war fought with bioweapons. That could be a world war fought with something we haven't even imagined. But kind of the root cause is the risk of another big war or a big conflict. And so to the extent that one can reduce that by working to promote international cooperation, I think that would robustly push in a beneficial direction. And it would also help with other coordination problems, like whether it's like global warming or other things, like whether it's a global commons. But it really, a small set of nations or one nation can kind of ruin it for everybody. And you really need to sort of find ways to bring people along. And then, I mean, with individual researchers and the universities and stuff, they can contribute in particularly promising, helpful research directions.
No, I think that's very helpful to get the big picture and big thinking. And so maybe the last couple of questions would be to probe a little more the project that you're embarking on about utopia and utopianism. And, as you were talking about that, it kind of struck me how science is about, explaining and unlocking these mysteries, primarily the natural world. Technology is about harnessing the power of science to do things that we want done. Religion and spirituality, even in a secular sense, to some extent are about just sitting in awe of mystery and seeing the place of mystery. And I wonder for you, where do you find mystery in the world? Where does your thinking sort of stop and you feel you're at the border of where we can go? And not to probe your religious beliefs, but in a philosophical sense. Is there a place for mystery in the utopia that you imagine?
Yeah, I do feel quite intensely that we are very much in the dark about the really bigger, the picture. We have very little idea ultimately of the whole situation we're in. I mean, so I have this other strand of work with the simulation argument. I don't know if you've come across that in your prep, but that dimension on its own, right, introduces all these different levels where all the things that we think we have finally figured out in rough outline might be just a tiny little crumb within a different structure that we have very little idea about, right? And who knows whether that's the last big insight. I mean, it kind of would be unlikely if we achieved the last big important piece of the puzzle less than 20 years ago. Right, presumably that will continue to, as there have been throughout human history, like just this radical transformation in our worldview, and that might just topple over our scheme of priorities in a fairly fundamental way. I call these crucial considerations. And it seems likely that we have overlooked at least one more crucial consideration. But the crucial consideration is defined. It's like an argument or idea such that if we learned about it, it would radically change our view, not just about the details of how to go about something, but about the overall direction we should even be headed in. And so I feel a very palpable sense that there is like something like that is still eluding me and probably everybody. And that therefore we have a kind of ultimate dependence on things that we don't currently really understand or control. And we can try to do the best we can, as wisely as we can, within this bubble of awareness or knowledge that we have been able to puzzle out. But it would be quite presumptuous to think that that bubble, the walls of that bubble, coincide with the walls of what ultimately exists. I think there's just more beyond that.
So, Dr. Bostrom, last question here. Korea Foundation tries in its mission to be very positive oriented toward the future. And so I wonder if you could, in closing, just share with us what needs to be done. You know, what is your big advice for how to make a better shared future for humanity?
Well, I think one could say some vague, general, kind of inspirational sounding feel-good things about that. But I think the real answer, though, will require looking at the particular of different options that are available and just trying really to analyze them. And you can then, for example, think that maybe if you work the numbers from various different value theories, that the thing that matters most is the reduction of existential risk. If you are a utilitarian, the future is just so much bigger than the present that even a small change in the probability of it coming about would tend to trump the direct effects of your actions of people in the here and now. So then the question would become, how could you reduce existential risk in the most effective way? And then there are different things you could do. There are like organizations you could donate money to, kind of have a division of labor. There are general things you could be pushing towards. I suggested global peace and coordination is one of these robustly good things that seem unlikely to end up in something bad rather than good. But you could also look more specifically at particular cause areas, like with artificial intelligence, if one thinks that's transformative. There's work on AI safety and actually trying to make research progress on developing scalable methods for AI control that would be useful. In biotechnology, one can try to better understand what applying a principle of differential technological development would look like in biotech. This would be the idea of trying to accelerate and promote avenues of technological progress that tend to protect against other avenues of technological progress, whilst trying to maybe slow down or at least not accelerate those areas that are relatively more risky. So like figuring out specifically which research areas within synthetic biology are like, you know, more risk preventive would be a way. And then one could try to do that. And, you know, one could try, again, at a very wide level, but ultimately robustly good, trying to make the world wiser and like more reflective, which might mean building better epistemic institutions, norms, educational systems, developing, I mean, in a small way, like whenever you're having a conversation or whether it's a public conversation like you're having now or private, trying a little bit harder to have it actually search for the truth and mutual understanding as opposed to like scoring points or being entertaining. There's like a little trade-off that every time we talk to somebody about some intellectual or ideological matter we are facing, and you could kind of, and so there's like a whole host of different things. But probably if somebody really wanted to get involved in this, they would maybe want to read various relevant forums, blogs, get involved with various organizations, read up more, get in touch with the community who's thinking about these things.
Thank you, Dr. Bostrom. I mean, I have to say, for me, our conversation was entertaining, but also really enlightening. I've learned a lot from your ideas, and I appreciate you spending time to explain them further to us.
Well, it was fun. Thanks for having me there.
Well, I hope you found today's discussions interesting, enlightening, and that they can serve as a stepping stone that helps us across the river of present uncertainty a bit closer to the far bank of a better future. Once again, I want to offer my warm thanks to Dr. Bostrom for sharing his insights, and we hope to see you soon on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you.